When the year comes to an end and I look back at my reading over the past 12 months, I'm often tempted to see only the things that I'm disappointed in, the books I never finished, the reading plans that didn't pan out. Not having read as many books as I'd hoped, but I also think it's worth paying attention to the many great pleasures I experienced, and to make a note of those books that have left a lasting impression upon me. There were only 2 rules I gave myself for assembling this list. Number 1 was that I didn't want to include anything here that I'd read before 2022, so none of my rereading for the year is listed here. And number 2 was that I only wanted to include things that I felt I could see myself revisiting at some point in the future. Let me know in the comments if you've read and enjoyed any of these books. And I'd also love to hear about what made it to your end of year lists. I'm always very keen to find new things to read. In February of this year, Russia launched its barbaric attack on Ukraine. Living in Poland, as I do, with Ukraine just next door, the conflict has been on my mind throughout most of the year. In Warsaw, one sees the yellow and blue around every corner, pinned to people's buttonholes, hanging from windows, spray painted on walls. I found myself turning to Ukrainian writers a number of times this year, and the one who stood out most impressively to me is someone about whom I've not really heard very much discussion at all, and that's Valerian Podmochylny, and in particular his novel of 1927, The City, which follows a young man, Stepan Radchenko, as he moves from his small village to the city of Kiev. The book follows a traditional Bildungsroman narrative. Stepan begins his studies at the university, steeps himself in the local literary scene, has affairs, etc., and in undergoing the formation of a new identity, wonders about what he has lost and what he has left behind. What I found so intriguing about the book was not so much its narrative, but rather its evocation of the city of Kiev, and particularly reading it at a time when it felt so important to remember it, to trace its topography, its architecture and culture, when all those things were and still remain under threat. In his article, 3 Novels, 3 Cities, Taras Kozhnarski discusses the idea of Kiev as text. The city emerges as a palimpsest, written and rewritten, laid claim to, idealized and mythologized. Kozhnarski describes Podmochylny's novel as enacting a Ukrainian appropriation of Kiev that is radical in its rejection and destruction of the previous myth of Kiev as the Russian Jerusalem. Kozhnarski points out, however, that it also has an introspective focus. For me, this attempt to chart the emotional and sensory imprint of urban spaces is one of the most compelling things about the novel. In some of its most lyrical passages, we observe Stepan filtering the city and its crowds through his consciousness. The crowd stimulated him. He longed to feel it with all his senses, collectively and individually, to pour it in through every connecting channel, into that enormous workshop where impressions are melted in the fires of blood and forged on the anvil of the heart. All the floodgates of his being were raised, and the frothing streams of the world poured into them, merging into a single turbulent flow along a narrow flume that turned the wheels of the creative mill. Podmochylny has come to be regarded as part of the executed Renaissance, a term coined in the 1950s by Jerzy Giedroyć, a Polish writer and editor of the émigré journal Kultura. The term was to become the title of an anthology that collected the writings of Ukrainian authors who'd been killed during Stalin's Great Terror Pied-Mohilny would only publish 2 novels. Due to questions over his dedication to the Soviet system, he began to experience difficulty publishing his work. In 1934, he was arrested, tortured, and eventually sent to Solovki prison camp. Ultimately, at Sandarmoch in 1937, he was shot and killed. He was 36 years old. Disorientation is not always a feeling that people seek out deliberately when reading. I think there's a fear associated with it. Fear perhaps of incompletion, of obscurity or lack of control. There are books, however, in which disorientation can be a central and even fundamental aspect. Gary J. Shipley's Dreams of Amputation from 2013 at times feels like an exercise in disorientation. Its opening chapter is a haze of alienating neologisms, cybernetic prose poetry that feels like some circuit bending of the brain. Dreams of Amputation is hard to follow, but that almost feels like part of the point. In its imagined hellish future, mind and body both occupy physical space, but not always the same physical space. Bodies are occupied, co-opted, abandoned. It is a world in ruins. Few people venture outside anymore, save for the most brutal and the most brutalized. Any consensus about what reality is seems to have been lost. At the core of the book is a kind of philosophical detective narrative, which, more than anything, brought to mind Philip K. Dick's A Scanner Darkly, with which it shares quite a few traits. Where it shines for me is in its vision of a desolate, pixelated future, so bleak that hope can only be found in absolute severance with the experiential and the sensory. Its most glorious section, and this is perhaps the main reason it made this list, is one in which the protagonist, Agent Nolan, is forced to sit before a monitor, and the world around him slips away, to reveal what can only be described as a hellscape. At this point, the book becomes a kind of exercise in perversion, an excavation of the darkest regions of the imagination, and Shipley lets fall a cascade of images. I'll pick out a few here. A miserable cloak of unscrolled faces, men searching through frozen limbs packed in polythene bags, forearms, knees, sections of thigh, a man with eyes domed in clear perspex, his fat neck a mass of scar tissue, sun-starved women clad in haunted dresses swallowing their screams, men caged in their own shadows, fly-blown torsos, fragments of cartilage and bone sprayed across the ceiling's sunset like impulsive stars, brains masticated by imaginary timelines. The next book is a difficult one to describe, but that, I think, is to its credit. Aaliyah White's The Beauty from 2014 does so many things. It begins as a post-apocalyptic tale set in a rural community that carries distinct shades of Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker, its protagonist Nathan, like Ridley, being one tasked with the telling of tales as a means of constructing or reconstructing communal memory. And the main reason that there is so much to remember in this community is that all the women have died, succumbing to a sickness for which there was no cure, and only the men are left behind. The community's favourite tale to hear, and the one which Nathan dutifully retells, is their creation myth. the tale of how they came to be. It is an idyllic Arcadian story, which, and Nathan is conscious of this, ultimately seems to function as a panacea or a form of palliative care that in reality does not account for the great sorrow, the gaping hole in their community. But down by the graveyard, something else is happening. The graveyard bears more mushrooms, clustering in soft, wet shapes, yellow folds and rivulets, in the outlines of the women beneath the soil. Aside from its interest in communal memory, the book is also a work of grotesque fungal body horror. Aaliyah White is clearly deeply interested in mycology. In 2020, she published The Secret Life of Fungi, which I'm sure would make an excellent companion to Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life from the same year, so I'm very keen to pick it up. In The Beauty, however, she exploits all the porous, fleshy fecundity of these objects, reveling in all their enigmatic, subterranean potency as imagery. In a fabulous portion of the book, Nathan finds himself face to face with a mushroom-human hybrid creature, a thing that stares without eyes, its smooth yellow flesh stretched over its head. Despite himself, Nathan can sense that he longs for its embrace. The ground shudders and the thing emerges. It comes to me, walking with a sway of its soft yellow hips, and stops within touching distance. I repress everything I feel, the horror and the longing. I reach out. Its own hand stretches out and meets me halfway, palm to palm. Cool, almost damp, smooth and spongy. It is a shock to feel its lack of warmth, but it's not unpleasant, just different. The smoothness changes. I feel a raised surface like goose flesh, and then the bumps become larger, prickly. The thing hums, high in pulses. The sound comes from inside it. I'm certain that it's very, very excited. We are excited. The book also has several further shifts in gear, at certain points investigating the politics of reproduction and domesticity, or the power dynamics within small communities, as well as the manner in which narratives can serve as mechanisms of control. Though The Beauty is barely over 100 pages, its scope is deceptively ambitious, and its manner of engaging with these huge themes is refreshingly unorthodox. Brendan Connell is one of the authors I chose to read extensively this year. I'd also say he's the author whose work I enjoyed reading most consistently. One thing I find so exciting about him as a writer is the many modes he seems to have mastered. So many of his books are wildly different from one another, but they all possess his distinct stylistic elegance and a rare, unorthodox, inventive flair. I could have picked any number of his books to include here. The wonderfully psychotic Miss Homicide Plays the Flute, or The Architect, an exuberant exercise in grotesquerie and excess. But it's The Galaxy Club from 2014 that captivated me most, and it's probably also the strangest among them. The Galaxy Club has many narrators, some of which recur, others of which enter for brief psychedelic interludes, alongside its many human narrators, all of whom have distinct voices. There are chapters during which animals and inanimate objects and even plants take the reins. Others are narrated by godlike beings that observe and intervene in the gritty, alcohol-fueled tale of violence and vengeance. Needless to say, this is all as disorientating as it sounds. And despite this disorientation, or perhaps because of it, I never felt closed out by the novel. Instead, I felt carried along by its hallucinatory stream of brilliant prose. A stream that branches through 1970s New Mexico, farmsteads and fields of maize, dilapidated towns, run-down liquor stores, astral landscapes. Its banks are populated by peculiar figures, a stranger in town known only as Cleopatra, a boy born with blue skin, cult members, wastrels and crooked cops. The book's flavour emerges over time as a peculiar admixture of gritty, low-life exploits and polytheism, the meddling of a pantheon of gods in mortal drudgery, regularly forces the reader to reacclimatize to new modes of expression and alternative planes of reality. In one chapter, we might be on a drive through ghost towns, swilling booze and prescription drugs, while in the next, we might witness the birth of a god. I came out of some universal weeping, some crying and screams, and rose tall, my hair shooting off in every direction, light and clouds wrapping around me, putting their ears against my flesh, listening to my heart as it thundered, my hands going up to the roots of the stars, my feet to the emptiness of the earth. Some mathematic mystery, singing broke out everywhere. But that was long ago when the rocks still had mouths, the sea hissed with steam, the sky a fibrous net. Some cosmic jubilation, dazed as I came into being. Brendan Connell is certainly a writer I'll be continuing to read next year. In particular, I'm excited about his novel Clark, and about the reissue of Cannibals of West Papua, which I believe the Great Snuggly Books is going to put out. Sometimes I don't think it's particularly useful to think of horror as a genre, identifiable only by its tropes and signifiers. Maybe it's more helpful to think about it as a corner of the writer's palette, a spectrum of possible colours and moods, or perhaps as an effect whose parameters and qualities can be dialed in and out, one moment fading to a whisper, the next clipping well into the red. Michael Wehunt's short story collection from 2016, Greener Pastures, could certainly be called horror, and it is perhaps unabashedly so, but for me that still doesn't quite capture the whole. I would say rather that it is steeped in the colours from that darker end of the spectrum, but that its real beauty comes from its emotional depth, the wealth of its imagination, and Wehunt's impeccable skill for potent images. Many of the stories in this book have a deeply somber mood. They take place in forests, on desolate highways, at the peaks of bleeding mountains. His characters are often desperate, lonely, or bereaved, and his mode of horror tends to emerge out of these landscapes and conditions. There are many wonderful stories in the collection. Onanon and Deducted from Your Share in Paradise were particularly impressive, but my favourite is probably the title story, Greener Pastures. Its atmosphere struck me as distinctly Ligottian, though its style is very much Wehunt's own. The story's protagonist is a long-haul trucker who spends extended periods away from home. Much of the story takes place at a remote diner surrounded by miles of night. The source of its horror is a subtle change in perception. in the main character being encouraged by a stranger he meets there to notice something that he had never paid attention to tune in to the message beneath the layers of white noise in the radio static, to wonder what is contained in the blank spaces on highway maps. For me, this reflects something that keeps me personally invested in reading horror. Its ability to bend reality into the shadows, to turn up the saturation on some of its darker hues, and to make us look at it once again as if for the first time. There was a documentary broadcast by the BBC in the mid-2000s called Bulgaria's Abandoned Children that left an enormous impression on me when I first watched it, as I imagine it did on most people who saw it. It focused on an institution for children with physical and mental disabilities. For almost a year, the bleak character of its care, or rather its neglect, was thoroughly documented. I'll refrain from showing any of its harrowing footage here. One girl, Didi, who is mildly autistic, finds herself among many children with severe conditions. She's bright and is at the beginning of her stay in the institution full of admirable optimism. This changes, however, over the course of her stay. Her character begins to fade through a seeming lack of stimulus. She becomes more and more removed from the world, eventually rocking back and forth for long periods of time in order to block out her awful reality. While reading the novel Zealous Immaculate by Audrey Szasz, I was made to think of the documentary again and again. Our narrator and protagonist, Tamara, reminded me very much of Didi, an intelligent girl who knows herself to be different from those around her, trapped in the most unfortunate of circumstances.
They told me that my name is Tamara, but maybe it's not my real name. I can't remember anything anyway. I don't even know where my parents are. The director told me that my parents are dead. She told me that they were shot in the square, in the city. There was a big shooting there. The people were all lined up in the square, and the soldiers who were standing up on the balconies or lying on the roofs of the buildings fired their guns. They shot everyone in the square. Nobody could escape because the army put tanks at either end of the square, so nobody could run away. They all got shot. The director says my parents are dead, but I don't believe her. One day my parents will come and get me. The director tells me not to worry. She says I am safe now. She says nobody will ever find me.
Tamara finds herself in a very similar situation to Didi, a remote, inhospitable institution, and she is eroded by the incessant friction between her surroundings and her inner life. The wall protecting that inner self, which Tamara is unable to breach herself, being unable to speak, is gradually worn down by those who do her injury, until the heinous treatment she receives becomes the only way she knows how to treat herself. The chapters, at least initially, alternate between two voices. One voice characterized by the childish simplicity of Tamara as a young girl, and retaining a kind of innocence even as they catalogue endless instances of abuse. And another voice, which seems to be the same character as an adult, far more lyrical and fragmented, but decidedly cynical and self-destructive. For the reader, The pain springs up in seeing how one voice grows into the other until all its innocence is subsumed. I was astonished by this book, which contains so much more than I've been able to describe here, and it's also worth stating that it's a gorgeously produced book. I urge you to pick it up. I'm also very keen to try Tears of a Komsomol Girl, which I've had my eye on for quite a long time now. I've said in another video that reading New Juche feels dangerous. One has the sense of eavesdropping on private thoughts that should never have been voiced. But what a voice it is, a peculiar mix of exquisite lyricism, prurience, violence, and spiritual ecstasy that I find to be unmatched by most other contemporary writers I've read. In another video, I've described Mountainhead as a peculiarly powerful reading experience for me, and Bosun shares many of its qualities. The book finds New Juche having moved on from Thailand to focus his gaze on the former capital of Myanmar, Yangon, and wresting from its colonial-era architecture a brutal, hard-edged poetry. In some senses, I came to see Bosun as representative of a maturation of style in comparison with Mountainhead. The exploits which New Juche relates in this book seem to be far more conscious of the mechanisms of desire and the points at which they intersect with cruelty and political violence. Explicit, uncomfortable parallels are drawn between the colonial suppression of Myanmar, Juche's own violent desires, and the violence to which he himself was subject. Throughout the book, the country is referred to as Burma, the city as Rangoon, seemingly as an overt acknowledgement of this colonial inheritance, an uncleansed stain on the British psyche, born again into all who are raised there. These parallels are borne out not only through an examination of that cruel inheritance, but also through New Juche's psychospatial interaction with his environment, both in memory and in his wanderings through Rangoon. This Southeast Asian city has the ghostly forms of Britannic spaces and structures superimposed upon it. Dalkeith House in Midlothian, where New Juche would take part in sporting events arranged by his school, becomes the spectral counterpart of the Secretariat, the administrative seat of British Burma, brutality deep in its brickwork. Juche describes the building as having been designed and built by a Briton and true servant of Victoria for the purpose of consolidating Britannic domination, and refers to the cruelty that none can deny embedded in every piece of stone that endures of that structure. He goes on, if I'm to draw this complex association between the cruelty and wondrous secret beauty of a Scottish sandstone vessel built in 1903, in which love and emasculating fear were married together for me forever, and any one building here in Rangoon, then the Secretariat is surely ordained with a natural right to that association. Beyond these more political considerations, one of the main reasons I read the book with such eagerness has to do with New Juche's openness to sensation. One has the feeling that he places intensity of experience above all things. The sharp tang of fried garlic in the basement restaurant, its reek of burned cooking oil, the pungent aroma of exotic tobacco, the slow humming inebriation and wasabi sting of the local beer. The deep attention and lyricism of this exquisite prose is undoubtedly the thing that makes me immediately want to seek out everything he publishes. Perhaps a few honourable mentions before I get to my pick for the top spot this year. I was utterly taken by the alien beauty of Olga Raven's The Employees, and two other books that I've discussed in previous videos at length might easily have made this list. and those are The Murderess by Alexandros Papadiamadis and The Professor and the Siren by Giuseppe Tomasi de Lampedusa. Unica Thurn's Dark Spring was also a powerfully disturbing read, but to discuss all of these would have made this video much longer than it already is, so it's probably best to consider their exclusion a mercy. I read and reread a lot of books by this particular author in 2022, and I'm conscious that many people around me have also been buried in his work. It's been an undeniably big year for fans of his. Of course, I could only be referring to Cormac McCarthy, but it's not The Passenger or Stella Maris that occupies my number one spot, as I haven't got to either of those books yet, sadly. Instead, it's 1979's Suttree, which I read for the first time this year and which absolutely stunned me. Given that the book's so well known, I'll try to speak about it briefly, but I do want to get across what I loved about it so much. The first paragraph of the book proper opens with a description of a river, and the same river is mentioned in its last. This seems to me a fitting image for what the experience of reading Suttree and perhaps even the structure of the text itself is like. While there are significant events that might be thought of like sights along the banks of this river, the bulk of the book could be described as a kind of slow, syrupy drift. The reader is tugged lazily along by a current that flows in a direction, though seemingly without a specific purpose other than to absorb the surrounding atmosphere and mood. And yet the current of the book is in fact controlled, and the river is given warp and weft by McCarthy's endlessly inventive and magisterial prose, which strikes me as being less constrained than in Blood Meridian, for instance, where its focus is so sharp. On any given page of the book, one invariably finds countless images that introduce that profound quality of making world and object blush under an attentive gaze. The book's river of vocabulary is arcane, lofty, and densely textured. Take, for instance, the opening paragraph of the main narrative.
Peering down into the water where the morning sun fashioned wheels of light. Coronets fanwise, in which lay trapped each twig, each grain of sediment. Long flakes and blades of light in the dusty water, sliding away like optic strobes where motes sifted and spun. A hand trails over the gunwale, and he lies athwart the skiff, the toe of one sneaker plucking periodic dimples in the river with the boat's slight cradling. Drifting down beneath the bridge and slowly past the mud-stained stanchions. Under the high, cool arches and dark keeps of the span's undercarriage, where pigeons babble and the hollow flap of their wings echoes in stark applause. Glancing up at these cathedral vaultings, with their fossil wood knots and pseudomorphic nail-heads in gray concrete, drifting, the bridge's slant shadow leaning the width of the river, with that headlong illusion postulate in old cup racers, frozen on photoplates, their wheels elliptic with speed. These shadows form over the skiff, accommodate his prone figure, and pass on.
This is the kind of language in which I can happily swim for well over 500 pages. Language that makes every detail of the world feel newly discovered and all the richer for being given the gift of words to transcribe its reality. The book also shows a livelier side to McCarthy, which revels in the ludicrous. There are barroom brawls, drunken shit-talking, the absurdly hilarious character of Harrogate. I expected this joviality somehow to be a quality I would find less appealing in McCarthy's work, but I found instead that this simply broadened his palette and gave a welcome counterweight to the book's more despairing and bleak aspects, of which there are many. The overwhelming poverty, and the depravity it engenders, the racism, violence and alcoholism with which Suttree's corner of 1950s Knoxville seems to be awash. The humour manages to glow through these fissures in the social fabric. Of course, there's so much I could discuss in reference to this long, richly woven text, but what stands out most for me is McCarthy's realization of the city. So often he sets his work in rural, expansive landscapes, but in Suttee, the densely populated city of Knoxville is a giant organism, its every corner evoked in the elaborate prose poems with which the novel is shot through. Its diverse population, its grime and clutter, its sweltering fish markets in summer and freezing winter alleyways, its down-and-out diners and bars, and most of all, the great heaving river that runs through its heart. Looking back at my year's reading, I was quite shocked to see just how much of what I'd read had been published in the 21st century, or had been written by living writers. This was quite unintentional, but it did lead to some excellent discoveries. I often find myself making quite restrictive reading plans, and just as often find myself breaking them. But next year I really would like to focus on much older literature, and to ensure that at least a big part of my reading takes me beyond the 21st, 20th and 19th centuries. I've already picked up some epics and quite a few medieval and early modern texts which I'm intending to read. Some Chaucer, Malory, the Mabinogion, some older Japanese texts, and quite a few more things. This isn't necessarily something you can expect to see discussed on the channel, but I do have a kind of longing to abandon the modern world a little bit, even if it's just for my own sanity. We'll see where it goes. I'm prone to changing my mind. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I was very excited to find that I'd recently hit 2,000 subscribers, and I still can't believe there are so many of you that are interested in hearing what I have to say. The support means an enormous amount to me. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.